So in my last recording, I showed you how to set up a for loop, and I talked about these three conditions or parts or parameters of the for loop header. Here I have my body between the braces. I put in some print lines simply for demonstration purposes to show you how the counter and the sum change each time it loops. And then I'm now commenting those out because I really don't need them. So now I've got my running total and sum, and when this finishes I have the value 10, which is 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 I believe is 10. So I end up with the 10 in sum, and you will be tempted to do this. You'll be tempted to say, well, the counter, when the loop finishes, counter technically has a 5 in it because that's what stops the loop. We're on 4, we get a 10 in our sum, 1 is added to counter, makes it a 5, 5 is not less than 4, the loop stops. So technically there should be a 5 in counter. So now I can take the sum, sorry, not the average, divide it by the counter, which is 5, and then I should get my average. The problem with that is you're going to get a compile error that basically tells you it can't find the variable counter. You haven't declared counter and set it up. It's telling you haven't done int counter equals 0. And you're going to say, yes, I did. I did it right here. I declared it right there. That's true, but that is a temporary variable, meaning it exists only for as long as the for loop is executing. You can use it in the for loop, you can manipulate it, you can print it out, but you cannot use it outside of that last brace for the body of the loop, because Java actually creates it for the for loop and then destroys it to free up the memory. So it has been completely deleted, erased. There is no longer a memory space in the CPU named CTR. It's gone. So you can't reference it here because Java has destroyed it. It doesn't exist anymore. Sorry, I got a little cough. So you cannot use counter. You cannot use any loop variable that you've declared right here in the for loop outside of the loop, unfortunately. Now, you can of course hard code a 5 here because you know it was 5 numbers. That's one option. What some people will do is this little running average. So some people will say, I'm going to keep a running average. Every time the loop executes, it will divide the value in sum by 5, and it will overlay or replace anything that's an average. So the first time through, sum is 0, 0 divided by 5 is 0, so average will be a 0. The next time the counter goes to 1, sum is 0 plus 1 or 1, it will divide 1 by 5, and what is that, 0.2 or whatever. So it will keep and it'll overlay the 0 that was in there with the 0.2. So some people will do that. And then some people will do some more sophisticated things to keep like a running average, and they'll try to leverage off of the value in counter to do that. And let's see what happens if we do that. Do we get the correct answer? And I won't get the correct answer because at one point counter will be a 0. I had forgotten about that, and you can't divide by 0. So you really can't do that. So some of you I know will have some sophisticated ways of tricking the loop into letting you do this running average, or you can just hard code the 5, or you can come outside of the loop and do it. So you either do one or the other. Eventually sum will get to 10. 10 divided by 5 on the very last loop will be your 2, and you'll get the right answer. So you either do it there, or you can come down after the loop and calculate the average, either way. Or if you're more experienced as a programmer or coder, I'm sure you can come up with at least a couple different ways that you can keep that running average in the loop. So again, I really want to reiterate, when you look at a loop header, before the loop executes the first time, one time and one time only, Java declares the temporary counter variable and sets it to whatever starting value you give it. Then, the first time before it loops, It compares the value in that counter, which is 0. Is that less than or equal to 4? Is that a true statement? Yes. It does not look at this quite yet. It comes in, it loops one time, meaning it takes the 0 that is initially in sum and it adds the 0 in counter to it, and sum is now a 0. At that point, when it's executed all the lines of code in the body, but before it executes again, then it adds 1 to the counter variable. Counter becomes a 1. It comes back and checks the condition. Is 1 less than or equal to 4? Yes. It loops again. Counter is 1, sum was 0, now sum is 1. Now, I'm going to add 1 to my counter. My counter is now 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 4? Yes. Sum was a 1. Counter is a 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. It comes back. Let me add 1 to 3 to get my 4. Sorry, let me add 1 to 2 to get my 3. 3 is less than or equal to 4. And it keeps doing that. And then on that last time when the counter is equal to 4 and the sum is now 10, after it does that, it adds 1 to the counter. Counter becomes 5. It checks before it does anything else. Is 5 less than or equal to 4? That is false. That is not a true statement. Don't add anything else to the sum. Find the last brace, find the closing brace for the body of the loop, and then come start with the very next executable line of code and continue the program. I think it always throws people that all of the information for the for loop is here, even though really this happens after each iteration. Doesn't really happen, let's just say from a logical standpoint, this happens after our loop is done its iteration and before the check on the condition. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. I know that is a little tricky. Now if I wanted to do this as a while loop for comparison, I have to be a little careful that I don't set up an infinite loop. I have to make sure I have a counter. I'm going to call it counter 2. I'm going to start it at 0. Now my condition is going to be very similar. While counter 2 is less than or equal to 4, sum equals sum plus counter. Now this is where I have to be very careful. I'm going to comment this code out. This is where I have to be careful. Oh, sorry, that's counter 2. Notice this is declared outside of the loop. This is not the same scenario as with the for loop. This is a regular statement. This is a typical variable declaration. I happen to be using that variable with a while loop, but that variable exists before the loop starts. It exists after the loop finishes. It is not a temporary variable. It is not destroyed. It is its own standalone thing, and I can use it wherever I want in subsequent lines in the program. So the problem with the while loop on this is just it's very easy to make it an infinite loop. At this point the counter is 0, 0 is less than or equal to 4, the sum is going to be 0 plus 0 is 0. Counter is going to stay, counter 2 is staying 0, I'm not bumping it up 1. So this thing will run forever because 0 is less than 4 and it runs again and again and again and again. So if you're going to use a while loop, just make sure that you add 1 to counter 2 so that eventually it becomes a 5 and the loop stops. And then of course we would still have to print out our actual average. And we get the correct answer. And of course if you wanted to, you could put the average in here, which some people will do, or you can put it outside of the loop, either way. So two different ways to do this. Very similar conceptually. The while loop is much easier to accidentally make infinite. You really have to try hard to make a for loop infinite. It's a little more foolproof than a while loop. So think about that, decide which way you want to do it, and let me know if you have any questions. One of the other common questions I get on this one is, well, I could just put five ints here, right? I could have int num1 equals 0, int num2 equals 1, int num3 equals 2, and then I could add them up and get the average. Yes, but if you try to put that in a loop, there's no need to do a loop if you're going to hard code 5 individual int variables. I don't know how you would make that work in a loop, because if you did like sum equals num1 plus num2 plus num3, etc., you're just going to execute that 4 or 5 times. It's just going to keep adding them up, the same numbers over and over for, like, 5 times. So that's inefficient, and they'll really ding you on that on the AP exam, because that makes no sense. That's completely illogical to do that. You can do it, but it's just burning up CPU time adding the same 5 numbers 5 times. So you really can't put them in separate variables with what we know now and use a loop to make it work. We'll see that there's a way in Chapter 7 with arrays and array lists to really create an array that holds 5 numbers and then with a for loop to very nicely add them up. But until we get to that point, don't try to hard code 5 different variables. Just use a loop to add up the numbers 0 to 4 as I did, or use scanner. The choice is yours. Now, I've only got a couple more minutes here on this recording. The other exercises in the first set for Chapter 6 are a little easier. I just want to give you a couple of pointers. So if I wanted to count up, and I can't find my file here, so I wanted to count up from 0 to 5, and I wanted it to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I did not want to print out the 5. I could set up a for loop here. It starts at 0. It adds 1 each time, so the I goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And when I is 5, it will stop, and I will print out the values 0 to 4 on separate lines. There's a loop that asks you to count backwards from 10. Well, I would start at 10. I can subtract 1 each time, so I go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, or I can do I minus minus, either way. But now here's the thing, this will flip. I will say execute while I is greater than or equal to 0. Notice the difference there, because I'm going 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I want to stop when I get to 0. I don't want to show a -1. So if I put my condition to execute as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, I will get my countdown. So that will help you with 1 and 2. If I want to count by 2's from 0 to 20, again, I would start here. I is going to be less than or equal to 20. And my computer is frozen up on me. NetBeans is frozen. I would say I equals I plus 2. And I'll go 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and I will end up counting up by even numbers. The trick with that is when I look at the last value in I is going to be a 20, but I won't have executed the loop 20 times, right? I'll have been counting by 2, so I will have actually only run that code like 10 times. Okay, and so again, I equals I plus 2 will help you with that one. I'll try to do a separate recording for the Fibonacci sequence. That one's a little more involved. You can also do any of the last 3 of these as while loops, just as I did with the average.